with us because we have some crucial details coming in straight from New York, as the managing editor of CNN News 18, Zakka Jacob, is there on the ground and will share more details about this crucial visit of Prime Minister Modi to United States. Let's take a look at them.
So it's a big week for Indian diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi is going to be here in New York as well as in Washington, D.C. For the first time in 9 years under his prime ministership, he's going to be invited for a state visit. Two critical issues, geopolitical issues, that are going to dominate the conversation. One, of course, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Remember, the Ukrainian president has also reached out to India to play some kind of a mediator role to try and use its leverage, use its influence with President Putin and Russia to try and broker some kind of a ceasefire. That is definitely going to be a topic of conversation when Prime Minister Modi and US President Biden meet. And they will be meeting over multiple occasions through the course of this week. There is a private dinner that's going to happen Wednesday night. And then, of course, on Thursday night, there is the state banquet as well. He will also get a chance to interact with Vice President Kamala Harris and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. That's going to be over a working lunch on Friday. But the Russia-Ukraine war is a very, very big backdrop for this conversation. And also remember, India is hosting the big G20 Summit in early September. So it's going to be something that is absolutely critical because the joint communique solely depends, or to a great extent depends, on all 20 countries being able to agree on the language and the texting of the joint communique. Remember, last year in Bali, in Indonesia, when that country hosted the G20, the negotiations went on for a number of hours, and finally at the nth hour, they were able to negotiate a draft that was acceptable to all countries, including, of course, to Russia and to China. Whereas this year, in the previous meetings that we have seen, whether it was the foreign ministers meeting that happened in Delhi back in March, or whether it was the finance ministers meeting that happened in Bangalore, the G20 leaders were not able to arrive at a consensus on the draft language, particularly vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine war. In fact, the External Affairs Minister said on 99% of the issues we had agreement, we had consensus. There was one issue which we could not, and that, of course, was the Russia-Ukraine war. The other big issue of discussion will be, of course, China. India has its own internal problems with China vis-a-vis what happened from April 2020 with Galwan and the change of the status quo, as it were. And of course, that is something that India is dealing with. It's pushing back against Chinese aggression at the line of actual control, but also in the wider Indian Ocean region. India is, of course, an active member of the Quad. We recently had the Quad leaders meeting that happened on the sidelines of the G7 in Hiroshima. But how can the Quad be more actualized in terms of preparedness for any kind of a military confrontation? Not necessarily between these four countries and China, but, for example, on Taiwan, where for China, they consider it a core interest of theirs. But at the same time, the rhetoric has been raised to such a high level by the Chinese that it seems like, and this is the perception amongst geopolitical experts and geostrategy experts, that it might be difficult for Xi Jinping not to be seen as taking some kind of a proactive, maybe even a military measure to try and reunify Taiwan. And he'll have to do that before the end of his current tenure. So all of this will form the backdrop, geopolitical backdrop certainly, when conversations happen between US President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi during the course of this diplomatic visit. Now, one big area of cooperation that has emerged in recent times between India and the United States is in critical emerging technologies. You saw how a few months ago, Jake Sullivan, the US NSA, had come to India and they had agreed upon something called ISET, the Agreement on Critical Emerging Technologies. Sullivan was there last week as well, firming up a big deal under ISET to be announced when the Prime Minister is going to be here this week in New York as well as Washington, D.C. Now, why this has emerged as such a critical area of cooperation is because ever since COVID happened and the world started realizing two factors. One, how much it was dependent on China for its supply chains, particularly when it comes to high-end electronics, smartphones, so on and so forth. And two, that more than 90% of the world's semiconductors were being manufactured by one company, the TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And because of the elevated level of rhetoric, including sometimes military rhetoric that we were seeing from China as far as the Taiwan issue is concerned, suddenly it came to the fore in the last few years that if there were to be some kind of a military confrontation between China and Taiwan, and the United States will have to inevitably get involved, then one area that is going to be very badly affected, or at least has the risk of being badly affected, is that of semiconductors. So India, among other countries, has sensed this opportunity to try and diversify the manufacture of semiconductors. So we're given to understand a big deal is on the anvil as far as manufacture of semiconductors is concerned. It is, of course, in the interest of the United States as well as big European countries, even countries like Japan and South Korea, which are big electronics manufacturers, to try and reduce their dependence on Taiwan for semiconductors, both from a technology point of view and also, of course, from an import-export point of view. So clearly, this is going to be one of the critical areas of cooperation between India and the United States. Like I said, a big deal is expected to be announced when Prime Minister comes visiting this week here in the United States. But also going forward, as much as there is strategic cooperation, whether it's on the Indo-Pacific, whether it's the common threat of China, whether it is, of course, the fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war, all of those issues will be discussed as well. But I think critical emerging technologies is going to be one big, broad area of focus in the overall India-US bilateral relationship.
Well, we have a lot to tell you about that critical cooperation between India and United States of America. But for now, we are taking a short commercial break. Don't go anywhere, as we'll come right back with more news and updates.